coming on a bunch of interviews. So let's start, Professor. So when people hear the word economics a lot, we are like, what is economics actually the study of? Like, is it markets? Is it
Well,
human behavior? Or is it something
the,
deeper? Like,
the
what are
simple
we
answer
talking
is
about?
it's a simple answer. It's the study of the economy, which is, if you want to put it in like a more generic sense, uh, we finally realized we're just another animal on the surface of the planet. Okay, we're not made by any particular god, so we're just one of the many, many animals that inhabits the biosphere of the planet Earth. But we happen to have developed a way of exploiting the energy that we find on this planet, and we raised our living standards well above those of the other animals. How do we do it? That's the question. And then what's the impact of that on the biosphere itself? So I put economics in that overall context that to explain human civilization, you've got to explain how we created a civilization in the first place. And a large part of that is how we managed to uh, harness far more energy than other animals on the planet can do. That's the basis of us having a civilization. And then we need to understand how the thing functions as a whole because it's an incredibly complex process.
Right. So does economics have a particular goal? Is it growth, well-being, or stability, or is it just randomness?
I think it's comprehension. That's what it should be. Um, so if you one of the great dangers that happens in economics, and it happens with everybody from Marxist as one extreme to Austrian and neoclassical economists at the other, is that they have a goal. They believe there is a goal to capitalism, and that ends up if that goal is wrongly specified, then they distort everything from to try to reach that goal. And that's a huge part of economics is like that. So Marxist economists believe capitalism must collapse into socialism. So that's what they frame everything around. Neoclassicals believe capitalism is the best possible social system for maximizing human welfare. So that's what they focus themselves around. Uh, if you have that, what is the Greeks call teleology, so you have an objective, a belief about what the system is supposed to do, then you actually that dominates how you think about the system. So any flaws you find in your system, you don't get rid of. You think, oh no, that goal has to be reached. My thing is just we just need to describe how it is that humans managed to get to the point where we live well above the energy consumption levels of other animals. How do we do it? And then that answering that question ties in the type of societies we've created, the way we produce goods and services, the way we distribute them, and then what impact that has on the biosphere that we live in. Because that's I think an incredibly important thing that has been left out of a large part of economics, because everything depends upon everything else, and we depend upon a biosphere, and we need to have an understanding of how we got to be able to live well above the standards of all the other animals on the planet, and we have to understand what that does to the biosphere as well. So that's why I've got a fairly expansive definition of what economics is about.
So in your definition right now, you named a bunch of schools of economics. So for
Mm.
our audience, could we go over a bunch of the schools and um, could you like define them or give an explanation for the
Yeah.
audience?
Okay. Well, that's going to be a long answer, but
Just the
there are
major
basic,
ones at least.
yeah, the major schools of economics in in modern times is first of all the neoclassical school. That's the dominant school, and the largest number of people in the academic economics are members of that school, in that they accept its approach to capitalism, and what they talk about is that capitalism is a system for maximizing human utility and minimizing the costs of achieving that goal. That's their starting perspective. And they think in terms of markets with good markets for selling goods and services, which are uh, driven by supply of commodities and demand for those commodities in each of those markets, and they believe the market reaches equilibrium, and explaining how that happens is their approach. There's the Marxist. They want to take another extreme. There aren't very many Marxists in academic institutions in the West anymore, but Marxists were foundation members of the Communist Party of China. So there's still a serious role for Marxist thought there, and Marxists in the West. I mean, now we're going back to the 1800s, but they believed that capitalism would collapse into socialism. Okay, they believed there was um, capitalism was a system of exploitation of the working class. The workers were the source of all wealth. Capitalism exploited the capacity of labor to create wealth, and there were competitive tendencies in capitalism that would lead to the rate of profit declining, and that would lead to workers overthrowing the system and bringing in socialism. Uh, in the middle. There's the school of economics that I belong to, and it's called post-Keynesian economics only because the diversion from the neoclassical dominant attitude occurred at the time of Keynes. It wasn't entirely done by Keynes himself, but that says, look, we've got a bunch of right-wing ideologues on one side of us pushing the market as the perfect possible system, and a bunch of left-wings on the other telling us it's all going to collapse. Let's just describe the system. So that's the post-Keynesian school. That's probably, I'm guessing, but between 5 and 10% of academic economists would fit into that bracket. Uh, another 5% might be Marxist, and the remaining 85 to 90% are neoclassical. And in terms of how people who aren't academic economists think about the economy, because all they normally hear is the neoclassical perspective, then most people think about the economy the way the neoclassical economists do, and they think that supply and demand analysis explains how markets work. So that's the overall. There are many, many other little schisms in economics, but those are the main three.
So from in the shift from classic to neoclassical economics, was it majorly the concept of value moving from objective to subjective? Was that a major shift?
That's getting pretty deeply into some of the concepts that I put forward in that Lex Friedman contest. So let's backtrack a bit. Um,
Okay.
if you go way back, and like people have been analyzing how does voluntary exchange work from the time of Aristotle. If you go and probably the Chinese philosophers probably go back even further, but if you take a look at ancient society, the Greek society was a slave society. The work was done by slaves, people captured in wars. So we think about Athens and we think about democracy, but the foundation of production in that system was slavery. The slaves
Hmm.
did the work.
Right.
And the Greeks did some as well, but the slaves did the bulk of the work. Um, so you had a slave society, and then of course in that slave society, uh, what you got in terms of commodities was based on tyranny. And in fact, Aristotle literally described the rule of the masters over the slaves as tyrannical. Okay, okay. But then, of course, there were exchanges between uh, Greeks at the same time, voluntary exchanges in what we would call markets these days. And the question that arose for Aristotle is how do they determine the price at which they sell? So he called that the just price. Okay? And he said, how do you decide something is just? And typical Aristotelian logic, he said that a just price is something that falls between a price where you feel like you've got too little and a price where you think you've got too much. So the just is between a sort of gain and a sort of loss. That's the way he described it. And then the question is, how do you determine that just price? And he said, well, one obvious thing is if it takes 100 hours to make a house and 1 hour to make a shoe, then a house should exchange for 100 shoes. And that's saying the voluntary exchange being based on the amount of effort that the producers put into making the commodities that they're exchanging. So that's an effort-based theory of value, and that is fundamentally the classical school of economics, which precedes the neoclassical. That's Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and up to and including Karl Marx. And it's also the post-Keynesian attitude that the cost of production determines price. Uh, the neoclassical you can find also in Aristotle, because he said at some point, what is the thing that determines it? He says, and this thing is in truth demand. So he then says it's the satisfaction that the user gets from buying something that determines the price. And so these are two polar extremes in how you think about the price at which things exchange. One says it's based on cost of production. The other said it's on the subjective demand of the buyer. Okay, that's what sets the price. So those two themes have flipped and flopped in economic theory ever since. Um, and what happens with the classical school was that they said production is the cost of production is based on effort, and they codified that down to say that it's the amount of labour that's put in by the worker that sets the price. Now, this led to a dilemma for the classical school because how do you explain profit? If you read Ricardo and Smith, and I know that's a large ask for a podcast audience, but if you do read them, what you'll find is that they had a theory about the exchange of goods and services in a pre-capitalist society, but they couldn't work out how it did in a capitalist society. So Smith has a famous phrase where he says, if it takes twice as much labour to kill a beaver as it takes to kill a deer, then one beaver should exchange for two deer. Okay? And he called that in this early and rude state of society before capital had accumulated in different hands. So it's before capitalism. We're all petty commodity producers, or we're all um, you know, members of a tribe hunting animals on the banks of a river somewhere, and the exchange rate will be whatever things exchange for as much labour as they contain. Then, when of course you have a capitalist system, profits required as well. And what Smith said is that when you have this accumulation of capital, the capitalists will hire workers to get work done, and and it said, and therefore something must be given for the profit. Literally something. No explanation of what that something was. Now, and Ricardo was the same. So Smith and Ricardo, even though they said that they developed this labor theory of value, or labor approach to value, they couldn't work out how to include profit in there. So Marx came along, and Marx said, I can solve that, because he said, if everything's exchanged at their cost of production, how do you make a profit? That's a real dilemma. And he said, well, there's one specific commodity, labor or labor power, the capacity to work and produce goods for sale. That's a unique commodity because when you buy labor power, you buy the capacity of workers to produce things. To buy them, you've got to pay their cost of production, and their cost of production are the things that are necessary to keep them alive. So one is labor. What a purchaser, when a person hires a worker, what the capitalist is doing when they put that worker to work is exploiting the labor of the worker. But to get their right to exploit that, they have to pay for labor power, which is the capacity to work. And one involves the number of goods and services a worker produces, and the other is the goods and services necessary to keep a worker alive. So the latter is a means of subsistence. And Marx said, for example, it might take 6 hours of labour per day to produce the goods and services that are necessary to keep a worker alive for a whole day. But the labour, the amount of the time that the work contract lasts for might be 12 hours. So labour works out as being 12 hours. Labour power is 6 hours, and the gap between the two is what Marx called surplus value, and that's the source of profit. Now, then he argued that there was a tendency towards a uniform rate of profit across all sectors of an economy. So producing, computer chips and producing hand baskets, all this stuff, he said there's a uniform rate of profit that applies, despite the fact that there'll be differing ratios of machines to labour in each industry. And that led to a logical conundrum, which was called the transformation problem. And it also led to the prediction of capitalism giving way to socialism. Now, this led to a complete inversion of how classical economics was perceived by the wealthy, because when Smith and Ricardo put the classical school of thought forward, they were in favour of laissez-faire. And what that was really directed at was the feudal system, where the feudal system all these controls on what you could and couldn't do. If you're a merchant, you want to go and sell stuff in Hyderabad. I have no idea where this city is located, by the way, but I'll use some of those. And in Hyderabad, and you wanted to get to Delhi, then you had to go through all these feudal estates, and every last one you went through, you had to pay tithing to the owner of the land. So that all these taxes and imposts that the feudal system imposed upon merchants. And the classical school said, get rid of them and you'll go to better society. So in that sense, the original classical school was pro-capitalist and anti-feudal. And that's one reason it was so widely accepted when it was formed between in the 1770s on, in originating with Smith, and then you had the Ricardo and like yada 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 coming on the other end. So it was a pro-capitalist and anti-feudal way of thinking. Now, uh, the standard of living for workers in the transition from feudalism to capitalism was actually declined. If you look at the English uh, society in which capitalism first developed to the state, you had, there was capitalism in the Netherlands where I live now before the UK and so on, but that's where it really took off, was in Scotland into the 1770s, because it wasn't just Smith we got at that stage. We got um, James Watt and the James Watt steam engine, and that really caused the increase in living standards as we started to exploit fossil fuels. So the standard of living for workers declined, because under the feudal system, when you were a feudal serf and you were owned by the feudal lord and attached to the land, you could be sold with the land, in that sense that the land was sold. So it was a form of slavery. But the the ecology of England and the political struggle between the king and the lords meant that ultimately the lords had controls put on them about how much they could exploit their serfs. And one of the rules was that a serf had to have no less than 4 acres of land to work for his own family. Now, 4 acres of land in England is a large amount of land to support a family, and it seemed that feudal serfs, even though there were obvious horror periods during the feudal period, would often sort of work 2 days and have one day off. Okay, it was a much, in that sense, even though far lower standard of living, there was far less work pressure. Now you go to the capitalist system, and you had what is called the enclosure movement to drive the serfs off the land and make them landless labourers who then have to go and work in the factories. The conditions in England at the time that this happened got to be as bad as the worst in, say, in Calcutta in the 1950s. Okay? Open tanning sites everywhere. The physical situation was appalling, and that led to a sort of working class revolt about the nature of capitalism. There were many near revolutions in the 19th century. So all this stuff led to the classical school turning from a way of supporting capitalism and opposing feudalism to criticizing capitalism and saying we need a better system. How about socialism? And socialism would mean the collective ownership of the means of production rather than a social class owning it. So that meant that the classical school started off as pro-capital and anti-feudal, and that by the time he got to Marx, it was anti-capitalist and pro-socialism. Well, at that point, the neoclassical school, and that's the one that dominates today, rather than saying, everything exchanges as a cost of production, workers are exploited, all this sort of stuff the classical school was saying. The neoclassical school said, oh, this is all about maximizing utility. So people buy stuff because they exchange something that gives them less utility for something that gives them more utility, and they'll do that until such time as the increase in the utility equals the increase in cost of purchasing the other commodity. And so you get these concepts of utility maximizing consumers and profit maximizing firms meeting together and reaching an outcome in which the market forces balance benefits so people get paid what they deserve. So the neoclassical school said capitalism is a meritocracy. You earn you earn back effectively your contribution to society. Both machinery, capital, and labour produce output. So the capitalist gets the marginal product of the machinery, and the worker gets the marginal product of the labour. It's a fair system. It reaches equilibrium, etc., etc. So those became the two opposing schools. They're both wrong, okay, about the nature of capitalism. But that then where the schism occurred. So what people would learn about economics is all about supply and demand and maximizing utility, and that's all the neoclassical school. And that took over in the 1870s, just after Marx wrote the first volume of Capital, because that was, Capital was a strident call for a socialism, and you had political opposition from the wealthy, and that led to them elevating the neoclassical economists to dominance. And in the 1870s, the classical school not quite disappeared, but it got driven out of universities, and the neoclassical school took over, and they've been dominant ever since.
Right. So, pausing for a bit, you spoke about a bunch of major figures, Adam Smith and Karl Marx. So, I was wondering if we could talk about Adam Smith for a bit and give our audience some background about Adam Smith. And maybe before Adam Smith, we could talk about the physiocrats for a bit
Yeah,
and
yeah,
their
yeah. I mean,
beliefs, and then we could,
yeah, yeah.
only
There've
then
been
I think is
all,
a suitable progression to Adam Smith.
yeah. Well, it's you had this gap between you thinking uh, exchanges set by the utility of the consumer versus exchanges set by the cost of production. That flip-flopped throughout all of human history until about the 1500s, 1600s. And at that stage, you had people like William Petty and other people trying to measure what's the level of output, because now it's, we've got a more sophisticated society. You can see goods and services being produced. Technology is starting to improve. We're starting to use energy sources like wind and water and peat, and to some extent coal, to fire production. So this is all happening in the 1700s. And the dominant attitude then came down to the cost of production approach. And there were many, there were what's called mercantilists, which were very nationalistic. So they said we want to accumulate as much gold as possible. That's where a lot of colonialism came from. But the physiocrats, I think, were the most interesting school, because they were based in, obviously, they were based in France, and they were called the physiocrats because their chief intellect was a guy called Francois Quesnay, and he was the doctor to the royal court of Versailles, hence physiocrat. And at this stage, doctors were starting to do autopsies. So for a very long, long time, you couldn't cut the dead open. That was sacrilege. But in the 1700s, we began to do autopsies, and then they discovered all these cables and tubes and wires inside the human body. And by analogy, the physiocrats said, well, there's a system of circulation. And the economy is also a system of circulation. So we use this idea of circulation of goods and services to explain the maintenance of an economy, in the same way that the body has all these tubes to circulate things to enable the body to function. And they were, at the time, France was a very agricultural society, much more so, much less industrialized than Scotland was at the time. And that gave them an advantage in a sense, because when you look in production in a manufactured uh, component, you put in a product, let's say you put in iron ore and coal, okay, out of the other end comes iron and slag. And there's a transformation. The actual product that's produced is different to the inputs transformed in the rate of production.
Excuse me, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
In the case of agriculture, you plant a seed. Let's say you plant a corn seed. You get 1,000 corn seeds back. So it was obvious to the physiocrats, because the inputs and the outputs were the same. They said, how does this come about? And it comes about from what they call the free gift of nature. So if you just put a seed in the ground, and so long as you can keep insects away from it and birds, it'll turn into 1,000 seeds. So it's nothing that the farmer he or herself did. It's the fertility of the land that is given, in that sense, given by God. It's something which is humans didn't create it. And so they said profit comes from exploiting the free gift of nature. Now, frankly, they were closer to the real world than any subsequent school, because what that became, the free gift of nature, we now call energy. Okay, and the concept of energy wasn't even developed to 30 or 40 years after the physiocrats ceased existing as an economic school. But fundamentally, what they were saying is we exploit the free energy we get from the sun, and then therefore that's where the source of wealth comes from. They made the mistake of not understanding, because they were an agricultural community, not understanding that manufacturing is doing the same thing. You're taking advantage of energy in the form of coal and peat and wind and water in the old windmills to produce output. And then the output's transformed. So you can't see, if you take in iron ore and you pump out iron, there's no quantitative, you can't compare one to the other. Okay? They're different things. So they talked about manufacturing being sterile. That's literally the word they used. So they thought all profit comes from agriculture, and everything just transforms the profit that's generated out of the agricultural sector. Now, Smith visited the physiocrats, and this didn't make sense to him from his point of view because he's in Scotland. And Scotland's not known for producing food. Okay, it's too cold and too hilly, and it produces some food, but food is not the major product. Instead, you've got these industries popping up. The first coal-fired production began in the early 1700s with I've forgotten the guy's name, but a predecessor to James Watt of the steam engine. And there were water mills and windmills and all sorts of ways of using energy to make output. But that's not what Smith saw. What he said is, oh, the physiocrats think wealth comes from land. I think it comes from labor. Okay, so he swapped the word land for the word labor as the foundation and said that labor is the source of that surplus. Then you get Marx's explanation coming out as well. So that's the cost of production approach had a flaw in it. Okay? And then the neoclassicals came along, and they opposed the um, cost of production way of thinking, and they said it's all about maximizing utility. But the trouble is, how do you measure utility? Okay? So they got caught up in all sorts of logical conundrums coming out of that. And you've ended up with an intellectual mess on all sides of economics. And what I've been trying to do, and because the post-Keynesian school literally came out of people who said, that's nuts. Your theoretical starting point is stupid. We want to have a realistic foundation. There's an extent to which post-Keynesian is just based more in realism. So when they looked at it broke away in the 1930s because, of course, according to the neoclassical school, capitalism reaches equilibrium. It maximizes welfare, fully uses all resources, etc., etc. Then how do you explain 25% unemployment? Okay.
Right.
So
So
out of that, yeah, yeah,
so going back, you said we Smith moved it from land to the division of
yeah,
labor. So could
yeah.
we elaborate on the division of labor?
Well,
Maybe.
that's what that means is most people see Smith as the father of economics. I see
Right.
him as the bloke who misled us from what the physiocrats had right in the first place. If Smith had looked at the physiocrats sensibly, and I can't criticize him because it's well before we realized even the fact that energy was a thing. Okay, what he could have said is, well, agriculture exploits the free gift of nature, but so does manufacturing. Okay? So we could have had an energy-based theory of production, and that's the only one that's valid from a physics point of view now. That energy is the exploiting free energy is how we manage to produce the societies in which we live. So Smith, instead of saying it was labour, did a lot of good things as a logician, as a thinker about the nature of the economy, but he ended up putting us on the wrong course. Okay? So we had the physiocrats who got it right, but were wrong about the role of manufacturing. Smith then says makes a mistake and said it's all about labour. So we suddenly lose the connection with the land. And economics these days imagines you can produce output by combining labour and capital with no physical inputs. Okay? It's nonsense. Okay? This is the neoclassical school talks about producing output by combining labour and capital. They don't talk about producing output by mining stuff on the ground and then putting it into a mill and processing it with labour and capital to make different commodities. They leave out the physical connection to the real world. And so that's why I see Smith as, I don't regard Smith as the father of economics. I regard him as the sort of unfortunate uncle who misled the whole system. And we've then had this deviation from what the physiocrats got right in the first instance. So Smith gives us the cost of production based theory of value, um, talks about competitive markets and the need to make them free of restrictions uh, to some extent, but he was in favour of controls and restrictions on finance, for example. And he believed in regulations improving the quality of products, etc., etc. But that was the classical cost of production school began with Smith. Ricardo then refined it in many ways, a better logician than Smith. Smith was more of a philosopher. Ricardo was more of a mathematician in that sense. So Ricardo gave us like the theory of trade, and I regard the theory of trade as a mistake. Okay, I won't go into that one right now, but he gave us the theory of trade and theory of rent. He's trying to explain many aspects of a capitalist system. And then Marx comes along and turns it into a critique of capitalism, because, as I said at the time that these transformations were taking place, there's a huge increase in physical productivity of the UK economy. That's why the colonialism was powered by the manufacturing strength of Britain. That's why they could invade India, because they had manufacturing systems that made superior weapons to what you had in India. And hence, the East India Company conquers India, and the rich British Empire emanates out of that. But it's out of the strength of the manufacturing sector that could be done in the very first instance. So you have this. Pardon me, I'm now getting a bit long-winded here. I'm sorry about this for people who are
Right.
confronting this for the first time, but this is the sort of framework I think you have to be able to really understand how the different schools of thought link together. So the fact that capitalism was great for the capitalists, lousy for the workers, and lousy for the countries that got colonized, you had this huge political divisions as well, and demands for the overthrow of capitalism, because for the workers, with the change from being serfs with some guarantees of being kept alive by the Lord, suddenly you're on your own. If you can't find a job, you starve to death. And the terrible conditions at the time, people were working 14-hour days, sleeping next to the machines. They'd get one day a week off, which was supposed to be devoted to church. Um, it wasn't exactly paradise. And so working class movements arose out of that, complaining about the nature of capitalism, complaining about the factory system. You didn't just get Marx, you got a whole range of what were called well, socialists, like, for example, Cadbury's. You know the Cadbury's company? Cadbury chocolate?
Yes,
Ever
yes,
heard of? Okay. Well, that
yes.
was started by a socialist. Okay.
Okay,
And the idea
okay,
of socialism, you want to share the benefits. You want the workers to live well. So the workers got houses on the Cadbury estate rather than having to sleep next to the machines.
right,
There were other socialists as well saying we can design a better society than this. Okay. Because
right.
for the mass of people, it was exploitation and terrible conditions. Um, and so that's what led to the Marxian approach coming out. Marx giving a
Uh,
looking,
uh,
yeah,
Sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
Before we move on to capitalism and socialism, and Marx, who I know is your favorite thinker too,
one
I
of them,
just
yeah.
one of them. But I just want to like even I mean I do agree with you that Adam Smith's theory of labor especially seems doesn't seem too real now with the day of in the current day of machines and artificial intelligence and all of that. But I do have one question for you. If I mean does the theory of division of labor and all that, did it have real world impact in the sense, would the world be different if we did not subscribe to that ideology? Like, do you think that would have happened or
No, no, not particularly. See, this is another thing. One of the reasons that economics has so much influence on society is that it has no influence on society. To explain the paradox, um, we spend our time debating economic theories, and you get passionate attitudes to different perspectives. So Marxist versus neoclassical versus post-Keynesian, socialist versus capitalist, etc., etc. But capitalism would still exist if economists didn't. Okay, you'd still have people producing goods and services for sale. You'd still have something resembling a government. All that stuff is just something that's evolved out of human society.
right?
So if you got rid of all the economists, you'd still have an economy. Now that's not like engineering. If you got rid of all the engineers, we'd be well, we wouldn't be talking, because you'd be in a different country and I'd be in my country smashing rocks together to make output. So engineering is absolutely vital for the state of society. Economics could be irrelevant. So I don't think it actually mattered. But of course, that then affects the policies that we impose upon that system. So politicians get into power and they will push the views they learn from one economist to another, and therefore economics comes back and mangles capitalism in various ways, whether that's mangling it to make it more socialist or more capitalist. And we end up stuffing up how the system works. So, ironically, I think the world would be better off if economists never existed.
So what you're saying is the course of events is basically survival of the fittest, and the best idea would survive.
Well, yeah, no, not necessarily, because then you get the best idea starts, but then the best idea locks out other ideas that are better than it that come along later. So you'd have all
Right,
sorts of
right. Which
lock-in,
is still
as we
survival of
call it.
the fittest.
Which
If
it's
yes,
it's an evolutionary system, and that's
yes, yeah.
evolution doesn't come down to survival of the fittest. If you read the evolutionary literature,
Hmm.
a large part of that comes down to cooperation being a factor that enables individuals in a species to survive better. That's why animals herd. Okay, so, if you herd, you're less likely to be caught by the predators, uh, and your herd can attack the predators. So cooperation comes out of evolution. It's not survival of the fittest. The fittest may be the most cooperative, not the most exploitive. Okay, so but yes, it's an evolutionary system. That's the fundamental point, and we should think about capitalism as an evolutionary system. And because the economics, by both the classical school and the neoclassical school, originated before we really got the theory of evolution, and also before we got the theory of energy. Uh, there are elements of pre-evolutionary thinking and pre-energy based production still built into the fabric of economics. And for that reason, I regard economics as being 150 years behind the times. And even though it dominates our minds, it's how we think about the economy. The way we think about the economy has been set up in a non-evolutionary um, framework where you don't acknowledge the role of energy. Now that's completely wrong, and that doesn't just the neoclassicals are the worst on that front. But all schools are to some extent affected by that. So what I'm trying to do is to say, if we hadn't had our own crazy ideas that developed before Charles Darwin and before the idea of thermodynamics was developed, Boltzmann and so on, and Claudius, etc., then we'd have a totally different economics. And economics has got itself locked in an intellectual cul-de-sac before we developed evolutionary thinking and before we realized the role of energy. So I want to jump over that cul-de-sac and say, let's catch up with the modern world and understand both evolution and the role of energy. And that, I think, is a better way to get economics done than building on what the neoclassicals have built, or the classical school for that matter.
Right. Okay, so now I think it's a good time to move on to Karl Marx.
Okay.
So so what was Karl Marx trying to solve with his theories, and could
Well,
we
in
yeah.
Marx, you've got to have a bit of a history of each of these people to work out why they behaved the way they did. And Marx was a, a member of a intelligentsia family in Germany, and he was a poet and a lawyer. That was his original training. He did a PhD in philosophy, but his father expected him to become a lawyer. Um, and then what he saw at the time was the dispossession of peasants from the Black Forest. Uh, and he became a critic of that and wanted to understand why it was happening, and moved from philosophy to economics to try to understand what he was seeing in terms of dispossession of the poor peasants out of the Black Forest to enable capitalist farming to take over the Black Forest region. So he got expelled from what was then Prussia, went to France, read the classical economists at that stage because he realized his philosophy hadn't prepared him to understand what he saw happening in Germany. And he started off being a critic of the classical school of economics, but ultimately became a fan, and then developed his approach to economics, saying capitalism profit is created by capitalists exploiting the gap between the cost of labour power and the productivity of labour. That became his explanation. And then he argued that capitalist competition would lead to capitalists beating each other by using more machinery than their rivals, uh, reducing their costs and bringing out products their rivals couldn't match. But in so doing, reducing the ratio of or increasing the ratio of machines to labour, and therefore, according to Marx's theory of value, the first one he developed back in 1844, um, reducing the rate of profit. And that would then lead capitalists to paying workers less than their value, and you'd finally have a revolution, that sort of stuff. But in the middle, he was trained in philosophy, so the philosopher that dominated German education at the time was Hegel. And Hegel had a concept called the dialectic. And Marx effectively forgot Hegel's concepts when he got exposed to economics until in 1857, by sheer accident, somebody gave him back one of his copies of books by Hegel, and he started thinking about economics philosophically, using Hegel's idea of a dialectic. And that led him to completely transform his explanation of where profit comes from. But that ended up also contradicting the prediction that capitalism would collapse into socialism. So Marx, confronted by reaching a conclusion that he didn't want, buried his own logic. And my first work in economics was to go back and show what that logic was and show that it contradicts the prediction, it contradicts the labor theory of value, and it contradicts the argument that capitalism will collapse into socialism. So this is going to get a bit hairy for people. I'm sorry, it's going to be fairly intense, but uh, the dialectic that Hegel had is again mischaracterized by most literature. But the basic thought that Hegel had, and that Marx used as well, is that they talked about a unity existing in a society. So a unity is anything. A unity is now that object behind me, the YouTube 100,000 thing, my shirt, my glasses, you. All these things are entities that are embedded in a society. And that society, whatever it might be, will focus upon one particular aspect of that unity. So if, for example, if we're back in a feudal society and we're talking about back scratches, for example, then the king wants a marvelous back scratcher, so you make it out of gold and rubies and emeralds, etc., etc. And you don't care about the cost of production because it's the king focuses upon what he wants, so you get this gold embossed jewelry embedded back scratcher. That's focusing upon the utility for the king. Now, if you live in a capitalist society, the capitalist is trying to make as much profit as possible. So they just want something they can sell in a marketplace. It's made out of plastic. Okay. So you get a different type of commodity coming out of the different type of society. So what Marx argued was that capitalism focuses upon profit, which he called exchange value fundamentally. So the capitalist wants to maximize exchange value, and that's the foreground of a capitalist economy. But that back to that unity, you've got a society and a unity embedded in that society. The society focuses upon one particular aspect of that unity. That's why I use the back scratcher example. The king wants something of great beauty and utility, and that's focusing upon the use value. I know this is getting complicated. I'll take a bit of a step back. So the dialectic is any entity is embedded in a society. Society focuses upon one aspect of that unity. That means that that's put into the foreground in society, but the unity can't exist without the rest of itself. So you've got this in the background. There's a tension. So you got society, unity, foreground, background, tension. That was the starting point for the way that Hegel reasoned. And then Marx did the same, realised this in 1857 and applied it to his economics. So what he said is the fundamental unity in a capitalist economy is a commodity. Okay? Because it's a capitalist society, the focus is upon making a profit out of that commodity. So the exchange value, the price of it, the cost, that's the foreground aspect. The background aspect is it's got utility, and you couldn't sell it without having utility, but that's not why the capitalist makes it. They're making it for a profit. So you get a tension between the use value and the exchange value of a commodity, and that explains the development of society over time. Now, Marx applied that to labour and said, I've now got a new explanation for why labour produces a surplus, and that is that the capitalist, when he hires a worker, has to pay the exchange value, so that's the wage for the worker, but what he's interested in is the use value. And the use value to a capitalist of hiring a worker is how many commodities the worker can make while they're hired. And the two are incommensurable. This is part of Marx's logic that what's in the background of because you put something in the foreground and the rest of the unit is put in the background, the tension between the two means that what's the commodities price is set by exchange value and the use value is ignored. Okay, but when you look in production, the use value of a worker to a capitalist is that they can produce goods and services for sale. The exchange value is the number of those goods and services you've got to give to the worker to keep him alive. They're incommensurable, so there'll be a gap, and that's a source of profit. Okay? So this is a new explanation. but it
Right.
applies to every last input. Okay? If you buy a machine, you buy it because it's a utility to you as a capitalist purchaser, is it can produce goods and services for output. The cost to you is the goods and services necessary to put it together. There'll be a gap between the two. The machine can also be a source of profit. Now, this undermines the idea of a revolution. And there's a section in a book called the Grundrisse, which is the German for rough draft. And this is what Marx wrote in 1857, preparing to write Capital in 1867. And in that rough draft, he spends about 100 pages dealing with this dilemma and finally bullshits himself, and that's what I'm going to call it, was literally bullshit, to say that in the case of a machine, its use value is identical to its exchange value. Now, that contradicts his underlying logic. Okay, and that's what I did. My first academic work was to go through how this all developed and explain where Marx made that mistake. But he made that mistake because if he didn't make that mistake, he was no longer a revolutionary. And this is often what happens in economics. They try to reach a particular conclusion. They reason from their logical foundations and contradict the result they wish to reach. They go, holy shit, I want to reach that result. How do I get there? And they make some bullshit assumption to get over the dilemma. So Marx starts by saying a commodity has exchange value and use value. They're incommensurable. In the case of ordinary consumption, the utility is subjective and the cost of production is objective. So that's irrelevant in terms of the functioning of capitalism. But in production, the use value is quantitative. It's the number of goods the input can produce. The exchange value is also quantitative. They're incommensurable. That's where profit comes from. That's an extremely deep way of thinking about capitalism. It was a foundation for a sensible analysis, and Marx trashed it and said it's still consistent with the labor theory of value because he didn't like the fact that it led to the conclusion that socialism was no longer inevitable. So what you've got with Marxists as a result, Marxists are just wedded to that conclusion that capitalism is going to give way to socialism. So they stuff up and ignore Marx's true logic. And this is what I find in economics all the way through. People are so wedded to the conclusions they wish to reach that they distort their logic on the way there, which is why I want to go back and start from the physiocrats and the dialectic and regenerate a decent approach to economics, which is not full of bullshit assumptions made to avoid conclusions you don't want to reach.
Right. So Marx essentially criticized capitalism a lot, but he never gave a solution. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, Marx was really a critic of capitalism. He wasn't an architect of
right.
socialism.
So
He
the
had quite
concept of
naive ideas
Marxism
about
was
socialism.
not, there are countries which adopt Marxism, which was not invented by Karl Marx himself.
It's a complicated story because there's a lot of extremely solid logic in Marx, which isn't caught up in the whole issue of the labor theory of value. So Marx was the first one to talk in terms of industry sectors and saying that he had what he calls he had sector ones. He had the capitalist consumption sector, the workers' consumption sector, and the investment sector. And he then talked about that demand for one sector came from the other two, and then you had internal demand for each as well. So input-output thinking in that sense. Marx was the second person to do it. The first was really Quenet. So there's incredibly strong logic there saying to produce outputs, you need inputs from other industries, and the outputs of some industries are going to be the source of demand for the others, and so on. So this intricate input-output system was a major part of Marx's thinking, and um, and that is part of what was involved in socialist planning in Russia, but also socialist planning in China. Now, obviously, the results of that two have been radically different. So there are elements in which the Soviet system just basically said one factory to produce everything, no competition, whereas the Chinese communists, influenced by a range of non-orthodox thinkers in Europe that they were aware of, have said, okay, we want central planning for the overall economy. We want rampant competition inside the economy. So they have socialist planning at the level of the 5-year plan and objectives for the whole of society, but not dozens of companies producing cars, everybody competing rapaciously in a capitalist system framed in a socialist one. So you can see the difference. Russia collapsed. China looks like it's going to take over the planet. So you can take a lot from Marx and so long as you leave out the elements of the labor theory of value and things of that nature that lead to logical contradictions, and you learn from other scholars who were influenced by Marx. So one of the main ones I think of is a guy called János Kornai, who's a Hungarian economist who wanted to explain why socialism failed compared to capitalism. This is still when socialism existed in Europe. And he came down to what he called demand constrained versus supply constrained economies. Now, I understand that the Chinese communists are aware of his work, and they realized that his point was you needed to have what he called um, uh, demand uh, demand constrained as well as supply constrained factors in an economy. And you need a balance between the two. And to some extent, the Asians' philosophy with the idea of yin and yang and Confucian logic was more receptive to that than the West, where the West thinks in terms of binaries, left versus right, etc., etc. So yeah, it's Marx has been Marx is part of the reason that China has succeeded, but it's succeeded by avoiding the ideological side of Marx and taking out the logical side.
Right, right. Okay, so I think now would be a good time to move on to the concept of money, which a
Yeah,
lot of people will be interested in. So, w what is money? How would you define money?
yeah. Well, this is again, it's ridiculous that you have to ask me that question because we've had a quarter of a millennium of economic theory, and it's still a question that everybody would think economists obviously understand and have an answer for. They're still fighting over a quarter of a millennium after economics began as a discipline. So some people believe that money is a commodity. Okay? Money's gold. We use a commodity to make barter easier. So money is the intermediate commodity that we choose to enable uh, barter to take place. Because one of the problems with barter is if you want to sell something to buy something else, you've got to find somebody who's in the exact opposite circumstance. You want to sell X and get Y, they've got to be selling Y to get X. Okay. Now, if that's not the case, then you use another commodity like gold as an intermediate. So A sells X to get gold, Y sells uh, the other person sells Y to get gold. They then use the gold to go and buy what they want, even though they don't directly have what the other party wants. So money is a commodity that makes exchange easier. That's the one perspective, and that's the way the neoclassicals think about it. So they think money is a commodity, okay? And there's another approach which uh, emanates from my side of economics, so what's called circuit theory and also modern monetary theory. And they say fundamentally money is a promise. Money is a relationship between a bank and a depositor in that sense. So money is fundamentally um, deposit accounts held at banks, which are third parties that people in a monetary exchange agree to a transfer of money, meaning that they're willing to transfer the good. So the barter approach that neoclassicals think in terms of is based on you have two people, each with two commodities, one they want to sell, one they want to buy, and they've got to work out a relative price for the two. So in the neoclassical vision of exchange, what happens is for every exchange, there are two people with two commodities working out a relative price. That's the way the neoclassicals think about money. The post-Keynesian approach and modern monetary theory as well is that there are three people involved and one commodity. So you have one person trying to sell a commodity, another person wanting to buy it, and the way that the buyer buys it is to transfer funds from their deposit account at a bank to the seller's deposit account at a bank. And with the monetary transfer, that completes the transaction. So you have, rather than two parties, two commodities, and relative price, you have one commodity, monetary exchange, and three parties, the buyer, the seller, and the bank. And that's in terms of what's logical, what makes sense, that perspective is correct. The idea that money is a commodity is simply wrong. Okay, so the neoclassicals have a wrong model where they treat money as a commodity and therefore subject to supply and demand, as they think. Whereas the correct argument is money is a promise of a bank to pay that you can transfer from one person to another, and they'll accept that transfer as completing the sale. So money is, and what money practically comes down to being, the majority of money is the sum of all the sum of all the bank accounts, private bank accounts, and that money can be created by banks. Banks create money when they make a loan, and that can be created by the government running what we call a deficit, because if they spend more than they take back in taxation, they're also increasing the amount of money in deposit accounts. So the proper way to think about money is as a promise. You've got a triangular system, a bank, a buyer, and a seller, and money is created by banks when they make loans, and money is created by the government when it spends more than it takes back in taxation. And to understand that, you've got to understand double entry bookkeeping. And ironically, most economists think they understand double entry bookkeeping and don't have a bloody clue about it. So I've developed a software package called Revel that is based on, one part of it is enabling you to model the monetary system using double entry bookkeeping. And you do that, all the stuff that people get caught in economics textbooks about money is simply wrong.
So you're essentially calling it a social promise. And
Mm.
so in this system, if you sum everything up, would it come to zero?
That's a good point. The promises, in that sense, um, if we're looking at money as a promise, which is what it is, then the sum of all financial promises is zero, because this is where double entry bookkeeping is so important to understand. And what double entry bookkeeping does is says you've got to divide your financial uh, claims into two divisions. The claims you have on other people are your assets. The claims other people have on you are your liabilities. The gap between the two is your net worth. And when you're talking in terms of financial assets, which are literally claims on other people, the sum of all financial assets is zero. Now, that means that if one sector of society has positive financial claims, then the rest of society has identical negative financial claims. So the sum of all financial claims is zero. But out of that, we create money, because money is fundamentally the liabilities of the banking sector. So if the banking sector expands its assets by creating loans, it also expands its liabilities by creating deposits, and that's how the private banking sector creates money. And then equally, the government do the same thing. It can expand it puts more, when its government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it increases deposit accounts more than it increases deposit accounts as the spending exceeds the taxation. The balancing item in double entry bookkeeping terms is the increase in the reserves of the banking sector. And what that means is that there are two ways to increase the assets of the bank. So there are two ways to create money, and we need to understand those two systems.
Okay. Okay. So then in a system, is it finite? Is there like a natural limit to how much we can create?
No, no, because it's a bit like, you're expanding both sides of a balance sheet equally. There's no limit imposed by the balance sheet as to how much you can expand both sides, as long as you expand them both at the same rate. And you have to do. When you need to get a loan from a bank, they say, here's 100,000 rupee. And by the way, you owe us 100,000 rupee to the cent. Okay, so there's an identical increase. Equally in reserves, when the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, reserves increase by exactly the same amount. So there's this equality applying there. But if you expand both sides equally, you can expand indefinitely. So this is one of the dangers of the financial system, because that's not true of the physical world. You can't expand production indefinitely on a finite planet. Even if we got into outer space and started producing output up there, there's a finite amount of everything, as giant as the universe is. So there are physical limits on what can be done, but there are not monetary limits. And that balancing that too is a large part of where our dilemmas come from.
So you said there's a finite amount to how much we can expand. But what is the limit? Because energy seems
Well,
to be pretty.
the limit is whether the biosphere can still support life. Okay,
Sorry?
because the limit is the capacity of the biosphere to support life.
Right.
Okay,
And
because we
yeah.
yeah, you keep
And
going.
and
Sorry,
do we know it has a limit? Why do you think it has a limit?
we're about to find out.
Okay.
Okay,
Right.
okay,
Right.
because I mean, the biosphere, that's why I started by my definition of the economy began with the fact we're on a planet, okay? And everything we do, we're animals on the same planet. How do we get to have so much higher energy consumption than the rest? Because the fundamental difference between humans and other animals on the planet is that we exploit free energy, okay? And the other animals don't, okay? We're the only ones that mine coal. We're the only ones that mine oil. We're the only ones that produce solar collectors. We're the only ones that make nuclear power stations, etc., etc. That's the distinguishing feature, how we exploit energy. We didn't create the energy, it existed here on the planet. But then, when we're exploiting energy, what we're actually doing is exploiting what are called low entropy sources of energy. This is, thermodynamics is something which economists don't learn. I've taught myself enough to get by because I know how important it is. But, I would never regard myself as an expert on the whole area of thermodynamics. But this is something which is developed in the 19th century by physicists. And what they realized was that there are sources of what you might call high frequency energy. This is probably an easier way for people to understand it. High frequency versus low frequency energy. So if you have coal, for example, and you burn it, okay, then it generates a large amount of heat, which you can use to power industrial processes, but it therefore generates waste. Okay, so the amount of energy is conserved, but you go from it being a high frequency energy, which is easily exploited, to low frequency that isn't. It becomes waste in the background. So you can't, if you're going to use energy to do work, you must generate waste. That's an absolute
Right.
given out of the laws of thermodynamics. Now, economics is ignorant of that. Okay? Most economists, and there's a guy who wrote a book called Growth or Reckoning, which I was asked to review last year. And it was a neoclassical economist trying to explain how we got from the uh, low level of per capita consumption we had before the 1700s to the total takeoff we've had since then. And if you look at the data, what you can see is that working in terms of average commodities, the standard of living of working class people, people who don't own the means of production, really didn't change between 1000 AD and 1700 AD. There were increases and decreases at various times, but no dramatic no increase in the overall standard of living. Then in 1700 it just takes off, and we've been experiencing growth ever since. The reason is in the 1700s we worked out how to exploit fossil fuels. Okay? So that is where growth came from. Now, this neoclassical economist, and that then because growth comes from energy, we therefore generate waste. We therefore dump the waste into the biosphere. We're therefore damaging the capacity to exploit that energy, and therefore we can actually undermine our own society if we don't respect the physical limits of the biosphere. Now, this neoclassical economist, typical of all neoclassicals, said you can have infinite growth on a finite planet. Now, that is bullshit. That is simply false. And that you can only say that if you don't understand the laws of thermodynamics. And those laws teach you that if you're going to use energy to produce work, to make something useful, you're going to create waste, you dump that into the biosphere, you therefore reduce the capacity of the biosphere to enable you to do that production in the first place. And that's what we're doing. The fundamental damage we've done is the carbon dioxide we've dumped into the atmosphere. And people hear this all the time, but they don't realize the scale of what's involved. If you weigh all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it outweighs the sum of all living creatures on the planet and all items humans have manufactured in their history. So there's more weight in the carbon dioxide above us that humans have added to the atmosphere than the whole living system and the buildings and everything else we've created at the same time. That's the amount of waste we've generated. That then, the danger of carbon dioxide, it's like a blanket because this again comes down to you've got to understand a certain amount of physics here. And I'm simplifying it, and it's complicated stuff. But when energy comes in from the sun, it comes in the form of photons, and those photons are high frequency. if that energy accumulated on the planet, we'd be totally cooked. So the energy comes in and it gets reflected out again, and the amount of energy coming in and the amount of energy going out tend towards being balanced. But the energy coming in comes in as one high frequency photon, and the energy going out goes out as roughly 40 low frequency uh, photons. So the incoming is ultraviolet and visible light, one photon, and the outgoing is infrared and 40 photons. Now, those photons traveling at the speed of light uh, hit carbon dioxide molecules, water molecules, and I think nitrogen oxide molecules, and get absorbed. And then they get re-radiated. But when they get re-radiated, they hit something, and then they get distributed in 360 degrees, anywhere at all. So what that means is a photon with a low level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, an infrared photon coming out of the Earth will go straight through and not hit anything, and the heat gets radiated away from the planet. But when you hit a carbon dioxide molecule that hits it, and it might get radiated out, 180 degrees to do that, it gets radiated back down as well. So it traps some of the warmth. Now that's why carbon dioxide is one of the reasons it regulates the temperature of the biosphere. At the same time, carbon dioxide, the main molecule that absorbs solar energy, the reflected infrared energy, is actually H2O, water. Okay, but the amount of moisture in the atmosphere is massively dependent upon the temperature of the planet. And or the temperature of wherever you are, so the temperature drops, the amount of moisture the area can handle falls. Okay, and therefore there's less molecules to capture the outgoing radiation. So if the level of moisture in the planet drops, you get a drop um, in the absorption. But because carbon dioxide is there, water falls out of the atmosphere. If a water molecule gets uh, dislodged from a lake, goes into the atmosphere, it can fall back down the same day. Okay, its water's rapidly circulated. Carbon dioxide, if it goes into the atmosphere, takes of the order of tens of thousands of years before it's reabsorbed by what we call the carbon cycle. So that that tends to that what will happen if there's an increase in radiation coming into the planet from the orbit of the Earth and so on, that will ultimately lead to an increase in carbon dioxide with the natural cycle. So orbital changes cause changes in temperature, which cause changes in moisture, which cause changes in plants, which cause changes in animals, which cause changes in carbon dioxide. That's the natural cycle. We've added a tiny amount into that from our system. The carbon cycle is huge. We're adding a tiny amount extra, but then the extra stuff we add goes into the same carbon cycle that takes of the order of 100,000 years, roughly, to return a carbon dioxide molecule from being generated by some process on the planet into the atmosphere before it gets reabsorbed again. So we're pushing up the carbon dioxide, and it stays there a hell of a long time. And that's what we've done. And as that continues, of course, that raises the temperature of the planet, and that changes distribution patterns for uh, water and air. And those changing distribution patterns mean that the industry and the agriculture we've established, which was based on a very stable level of carbon dioxide and therefore a very stable temperature, total average temperature for the planet, that's now being disturbed. So we've raised the temperature of the planet by between 1770, which is when you really got the takeoff in use of coal. That's when the Industrial Revolution really began, was with James Watt's steam engine. From that point on, we've been increasing carbon dioxide by of the order of 0.5%, the total about per year, and it's just a compound rate of growth. Now that means that when carbon dioxide was 280 parts per million, which is where it's been for basically the last 15,000 years, uh, we had a higher level of temperature than applied in the previous ice age, about 6 degrees warmer. But that enabled us to establish sedentary agriculture. And that sedentary agriculture was the foundation of us developing the societies we have now. We need the rain to continue falling roughly where we've got the farms, okay, and we need the temperature on the farms to remain roughly the level that we set it at, that made that particular type of farming possible. As we boost the temperature, those patterns change. And those patterns, because we're increasing the carbon dioxide so rapidly, uh, in geological terms, uh, there's no possibility for our systems or the natural system to evolve fast enough to cope with those changes. So we're destroying the capacity of the biosphere to maintain the life that existed on the biosphere when we were at the pre-industrial level the last 15,000 years of about 280 parts of, it was actually 278 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, we've boosted that to about 420, 430. There are other chemicals we've pumped up there as well that have made it higher still. So we're changing the temperature of the biosphere, which changes the distribution of where water and air move in the atmosphere and the oceans. And that's going to destroy the stable basis on which we built our civilization. So if we don't recognize that, we're destroying capitalism by creating capitalism. And that's the dilemma I think we're now in, and we haven't seen it happening because of this bunch of neoclassicals in charge who don't even realize the role of energy in production. So all this has happened with a supposed discipline to understand it that doesn't understand production in the first place, and therefore we're potentially destroying our capacity to have civilization.
Oh, I need
Yeah,
to wrap
I
my
know.
mind around that.
Mm,
Okay. So, moving on. So, can we talk about complex systems for a minute? So,
yeah,
um, complex systems, complex adaptive systems. So, is the economy better understood as a machine, or rather, a complex system like a living body, or
definitely a complex system.
definitely a
The,
complex system?
okay, the machinery
So,
analogy is just false, and that's
it's just
neoclassical is really called a mechanical analogy rather than a biological one.
right. And it's very common for people nowadays to talk about like how the economic machine works and things like that,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
yes, I've
We've
seen a bunch of
got to
those.
hit the brakes, hit the brakes
Yes,
on the
yes,
economy.
yes,
We've
yes,
got to hit the accelerator, et cetera, et
yes,
cetera. Completely false analogy. I had
yes.
a wonderful student in my class in Australia at one stage. I was teaching this back in the University of Western Sydney, and he said, uh, we make all these mechanical analogies about the economy: step on the gas, hit the brakes, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, and they would think, therefore, we talk about it as something we can control, just like we control a car. He said, what if we thought about it as a forest? And we're saying, I think the forest would work better if we got rid of that species and introduced this one. Uh-uh. When you suddenly realize it's a biological system rather than a mechanical, you don't tamper with that and know what the consequences are going to be. You've got to be very cautious about tampering with a biological system. But if it's a mechanical system, we fuck it around like crazy.
Right. So is the can we define a complex system by its ability to not by it by the ability that we cannot predict what's going to happen next? Is that
It,
a
it,
good way
it,
to
a
is
complex
that a
system is complicated to explain, okay? But
right,
a complex, it's a simple system is a linear one. And a linear system, uh, if you double the inputs, you double the outputs, okay? Um, so if you think in a linear way, you're not thinking in a complex systems way. In a complex system, there are feedbacks between components of a complex system. So if you double all inputs, you might halve outputs in terms of the feedbacks that occur. Now that's a poor example, but it's interactions between a complex system is one where the interactions between the parts are more important than the parts themselves, the
right,
feedbacks.
right,
Okay,
right,
whereas a linear system, you say just add the parts together and you get the total. Okay,
right. And the parts in an economy are human beings, which who cannot be predicted. So
no, that's not the only, but it's that attitude to complex systems means people think you've got to model in a multi-agent way and look at things that way. But in fact, the very first discovered complex system or modeled complex system was based on the weather. This is work by a meteorologist called Edward Lorenz in the early 1960s. And what he did was he was a meteorologist, so he's trying to predict the weather, but he's a mathematician at the same time, and he knows a lot about mathematics, far more so than the average economist ever. But in trying to model the interactions of the atmosphere, it's known at this time that what are called the Navier-Stokes equations describe fluid flow dynamics. Okay, but they're incredibly complicated nonlinear equations nobody's ever solved. Okay, so people would instead model the weather as a linear system that models linear interaction between temperature and moisture content and wind speed, etc., etc., to try to predict what tomorrow's weather is going to be. And they'd also do pattern matching, so that say if we had 6 days in a row with this particular temperature pattern, and the same thing applied 50 years ago, then our prediction for tomorrow is what happened the seventh day 50 years ago, that sort of combination. Now, what Lorenz did is say this is wrong because we're ignoring the nonlinear interactions. So increasing the moisture content of the air, for example, does not have a, you don't just linearly add that to the temperature. That changes the temperature as well. There are feedbacks. So he took these Navier-Stokes equations. I think somebody else actually did the original mathematics, and I think they're, it's a huge equation in terms of the number of dimensions. I think there's 11 different dimensions to it, and it's involved both time and location on the planet. So it's what's called a partial differential equation, because there are two factors at least in terms of determining the weather at any particular point. It's both the temperature and the location on the planet. So, two-dimensional. That's what's called partial differential equations. He used somebody else's technique that had reduced that from 11-dimensional partial differential equations to a three-dimensional ordinary differential equation. And what that fundamentally was is like a model of a drop of water on a hot plate. So if you imagine you've got a hot plate, obviously the hot plate's got a temperature, the hot plate's hotter than the air above it. You put a drop of water on the hot plate, and it can go backwards or forwards. So you can, the hot plate's flat, so you can draw like a grid. Is it going backwards or forwards? Is it going left or right? The motion of that drop of water ended up being incredibly complicated. But you look at the equations that were involved, there are only three equations. This is not quite correct, but this is a way of understanding it. It's like the x and y location, the horizontal and vertical location of a drop of water, and the temperature difference between the drop of water and the air above it, that sort of thing. And the pattern was incredibly complicated. I can actually demonstrate that and show it on the screen if that would help for people to see what I'm talking about.
Sure. Yeah.
You want to include that? So I'll just actually have to load that particular model. So you do a bit of editing here. Let's just find Lorenz model here. Hang on a second. This is done on my Ravel software. So I'll find one. Let's see. Okay. Just got to load it right now. Okay, and just give me a second. I'll share my screen in a moment. So you've made it possible for me to share the screen.
I think you can. Yes.
Yeah, okay, let's go and give it a try. So share screen. No, I've got to send a request to you. You've got to now
Oh,
approve
yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll share my screen now. Now brace yourself if you're not a mathematician, because I'm going to show some mathematical equations. So can you see those equations there?
Yeah.
Okay. Now if people aren't used to equations, that's what they call the Migo effect. My eyes glaze over. Okay. But strictly speaking, this is an incredibly simple system. You've got three constants, A, B, and C. You've got three variables, X, Y, and Z. And you've got the rate of change of X is A multiplied by the gap between Y and X. The rate of change of Y is X multiplied by the constant B minus Z minus Y. The rate of change of Z is X times Y minus C times Z. Really simple equation. But what it generates in terms of behavior is the following. I'll just get this running. And the model ends up having three equilibria, and they're all mathematically unstable. So the system starts at some point, gets attracted to and repelled away from the different equilibria, and fluctuates indefinitely. Now, this was never seen before. People thought if you're going to get fluctuations in a system, you need exogenous shocks to cause those fluctuations, something coming in from outside the system. And people thought that equilibria would attract a system. Now, in fact, this has got three equilibria, all of which are repelling the system, and you never reach equilibrium. And this incredibly complicated behavior, when it was first seen, was called chaos theory, because it looked chaotic, because when it was done, all that all that the mathematician who saw this was seeing were numbers, not graphs. This is back in the 1960s, so it's before we had graphical user interfaces and stuff like that. Column of numbers for the X and Y and Z values, which are stored here. And they were just crazy, crazy pattern. He couldn't understand this. He didn't see this,
And
that
this
you've
is
got
just
to
for
have
three variables.
three variables, okay? Just three variables and three
Right.
constants, okay? No exogenous shock. It goes on forever, okay? And he saw the numbers and he was completely stunned and said, oh, this is weird. I didn't expect this. So he told the technician who gave him the printout, start it again at this number and see what happens. Now, the computer he was using calculated to 6 digits of internal accuracy, right? But the printer printed to 4 digits of accuracy. So the technician went back and typed in the 4 digits at the start for the three numbers and got a completely different pattern. And this was also, I'm not illustrating here, this is just one particular pattern. I might even see if I can actually find, pardon, sorry, I didn't mean to pause the screen sharing. What I want to do is find another one where I showed initial conditions. Let's see if I can just actually find one of those and just so, this is my huge collection of models. Uh, Lorentz initial conditions. Okay, let's try this one. So this is the same system, but I have two simulations going on. And I'll just actually pause this one and go across to this model. So let's make this full screen. Okay. So what I've got now is I've got the same thing, three variables and three constants and three variables, but the initial conditions in one are slightly different to the initial conditions in the other. And when I simulate it, initially you can't tell that there's any difference. They're completely close to each other because the initial conditions differ by 0.00001, a tiny, tiny amount. But that difference is being amplified at every time step. And as this continues on, you'll start to see that there are two patterns coming out, not just one. And at a point, they're going to diverge from each other, and they diverge so completely that you can't, you've lost all the information you had initially, which was accurate to say 6 decimal places. After about 15 time cycles here, completely lost, and you have no idea where the system is going to go. I'm waiting for this to start diverging. It's still pretty close to each other. This is plotting the X value for both simulations. You can see the numbers are still virtually identical to each other. You can't tell them apart. Now you can just start to see the colors changing here. And what's happening, the initial conditions are diverging exponentially. So at some point, what you knew back here, which was precise to say 6 decimal places, is now completely lost over here. You've lost all that information. So you've only got a finite horizon where your prediction of where you're going to be in, say, 10 seconds is correct. And then after 15 seconds, this is this is the hot plate on the drop of water on the hot plate. It's in a position utterly different to what you expected because your measurement wasn't quite perfect. So unless you had infinite accuracy back here, your prediction is going to be utterly false in a matter of a few seconds over here. And that's one reason at the level of the atmospheric system that we can only predict a certain number of days in advance. Okay, so this is where the idea of complexity and chaos theory came from. And so a complex system has behavior completely unlike a linear system. And when this was revealed to meteorologists back in the 1960s, they said, oh, yeah, good point. We're going to modify our models. And we now are going to include this sort of dynamics as well as other factors in predicting the weather. So if you go back to the 1950s, the accuracy of weather prediction was far lower than today, even though the weather now is more chaotic than it was in the 1950s because of what we've done to the climate. So meteorologists immediately adopted the insights that came out of this approach to modeling, seeing the economy as a complex system. But to economists, that was a challenge because a complex system doesn't reach equilibrium. And their
Right.
view of capitalism is it reaches equilibrium. So economists have been, some of them have got some knowledge about complex systems. They're not all stupid. Well, they're not stupid, but they're not all uninformed. Some of them are aware of them, but they can't bring them in completely because that ruins their equilibrium thinking about the economy. And they just they've kept this in a pre-complex systems way of thinking about the economy, when all the other sciences, all the genuine sciences, economics is not a science, but all the genuine sciences have adopted complex systems in some guise or other, and they're quite capable of doing it. Nobody's ideologically offended that the weather is non-linear, okay? But economists are offended with the results that you don't reach equilibrium if you say it's non-linear and complex. Let's pretend it's equilibrium and simple. And therefore, we've got
Right.
a juvenile approach to economics, mathematics, the mathematics of economics being done by mainstream economists.
So we spoke a lot about prediction, and you famously predicted the 2008 financial crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about that, and could you also talk about why a lot of economists fail to predict it? And if you
Yeah,
could
well,
also talk about things that caused the crisis too.
yeah, well, the fundamental cause of the crisis was too much private debt and a collapse in the rate of growth of private debt. And that's something I saw because I did who's a neoclassical economist before the crisis.
Professor, I think
Yeah,
we lost you for a second.
yeah, I
Oh,
saw
I
you
think
froze for a second as well. So,
okay. So
yeah,
could we restart
yeah,
from
okay,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
okay. So I saw the financial crisis coming because I did my PhD on modeling Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And Minsky developed that hypothesis to explain why the Great Depression occurred. And he based his work on the work of a guy called Irving Fisher, who said that the crisis was caused by too much private debt uh, in a circumstance of falling prices. So a combination of too high level of debt and deflation rather than inflation. So Fisher called his hypothesis the debt deflation theory of Great Depressions. Now, an essential part of that argument was that banks create money by creating loans. And equally, when you pay loans off, you destroy money. So if you have a period, like a sort of comfortable period of capitalism, some people are paying off their debt, other people are taking on new debt. So the level of debt is, in the aggregate either remains constant or grows. But if you get to the point where the people have what they regard as too much debt because they've got to service the debt and they look at it and they think I can't afford to pay my debts, I'm going to go bankrupt unless I get more sales in. I know what I'll do. I'll reduce my prices and get everybody to come into my shop rather than my competitor's shop. With competitors in the same situation, they do the same thing. You will both all reduce your prices. You pay your debt off to some extent, but you've actually reduced the price level for everything in the process. And what has actually happened is the ratio of your outstanding debts to your current income actually rises because you've dropped the prices more than you've dropped your debt level. And so you get an increase in the ratio of debt, even though debt's falling, ratio of debt to GDP. So that was Irving Fisher's explanation for the Great Depression. I produced a mathematical model of it, which showed that you could have a period of a set of cycles in a capitalist economy leading to a boom and bust. In fact, I might even probably is it worth me sharing a simulation of that so I can
Sure.
show what people I'm talking about. Okay, I'll just load
But
one
I
of those.
don't think like the audience will completely understand, but I think we can still go ahead with it.
Yeah, it's just to show the visualization. This is the approach to economics that I had in the back of my mind, or the front of my mind, when I was building, when the financial crisis came along. So um, let's see, uh, let's see. I'll do a flowchart version here. Hope this loads okay. I'll bring it up and I'll talk to it, and you can show the video while I'm talking to it.
Hmm.
Okay. So this is using my Ravel software to do a dynamic model, which uses flowcharts as it happens to show the dynamics. So let's see if I share this and share that screen. You should see the pattern there. And I won't try to explain it. It's a flow chart. So output determines employment, which determines wages, which determines the level of profit, which determines investment, which determines the rate of change of capital, which determines the level of debt. So it's feedback process. If I simulate that model, I get cycles that involve a rising level of private debt to GDP and a falling level of income going to workers, and it looks like the system is stabilizing, so you get diminishing cycles for a while. but then you start getting expanding cycles, and it's not as complicated as the weather model I showed a moment ago in terms of its dynamics, but it's the same basic characteristics. So this system looks like you're heading towards equilibrium, then you diverge, and then you have a breakdown, which causes an economic collapse. Okay? So that's the mathematical model I had in the back of my mind when I started looking at the level of private debt in 2005, uh, largely because I was involved in a court case as an expert witness, and I hadn't looked at this debt data since I did my PhD. And then I saw this rising ratio of private debt to GDP, and I said this rising ratio can't continue. So my mathematical model is likely to turn up here, and uh, I won't try to share the data, but what I looked at, I saw a rising level of private debt in America, and the rising, therefore, increase in the ratio of the increase in debt per year ended up equaling 15% of GDP. And that was the highest it had ever been in America's history. And I said, this can't continue on indefinitely. At some stage, the people have to start trying to pay their debt down like they did in the Great Depression. And when there does, there'll be an economic crisis. So that's why I
Hmm.
predicted the crisis. I started predicting it from December of 2005. Now, neoclassicals, and this is the crazy thing, using their prior thoughts about what banking is, they treat banks as what they call intermediaries who don't actually lend money. They just enable savers to lend to borrowers. So there's the level of private debt in their thinking has no impact upon the economy. They didn't even look at the level of private debt. So they expected 2008 to be a great year. Ben Bernanke gave a report to Congress on the 18th of July 2007 and told the Congress that the economic growth in 2008 was likely to be 2.75% in real terms. It actually was minus 2.5%. Okay, so they had no idea it was coming, and that's why only a handful of people like myself who focus upon the role of credit or debt in the economy actually had any idea it was approaching. That was myself, Nero Rubini, Dean Baker, Robert Schiller, a few people, but the vast majority of economists, Ramanan, I can't think of his name, but the Indian guy who became chief of the Indian Central Bank, he was
Raghunam
asleep.
Rajan, Raghuram.
He was
Yes,
aware of it.
yes,
So a handful of people who look at the level of private debt were aware the crisis is coming. The vast majority of economists who ignored the level of private debt had no damn idea. So it
right.
wasn't that I was a genius or that I had unique insights. It's just that neoclassical economists put blinkers over their eyes when it comes to the banking system. They don't even look at it. They weren't even looking at the causes. That's why they couldn't see the crisis coming. But it was not a black swan. It's something which is obvious if you look at the data properly, but neoclassicals ignore the relevant data.
So, I mean, you use the word black swan. Do you have a take on Nassim Taleb's ideologies and things like that?
Yeah, Taleb. I mean, Taleb is the most important thing Taleb has done is talk about what he calls anti-fragility,
Hmm.
because there's an obsession in economic theory about efficiency, and like if you're efficient, then you are perfectly tuned to the current state of the environment. Okay, if the state of the environment it changes, you're dead. Okay, so like one of the most efficient organisms on the planet is the koala. Okay, and the koala has there's about 200 varieties of eucalyptus trees as it happens, and the koala has managed and eucalyptus oil is an antiseptic. You can put in eucalyptus oil to stop organisms growing. Somehow these koalas have managed to find a way to process the oil and make it into a nutrient for them. And
Oh, wow.
there's about 20 of the 200 eucalyptus trees that they can eat and stay alive on. And um, and if there's a change in the environment and those trees change their location, like where they're physically able to grow, so they die in one region and they only grow in a different region, koalas are toast. They're done. Okay, so if you get totally adapted to your current environment, you're fragile. You might be efficient, but you're fragile. So his concept of anti-fragility, I think, is extremely important. And
Yes,
if
and
we
it
think
applies
in
to everything, not just economics too.
yeah, it isn't just you don't want efficiency, you want robustness. You want to be able
Yes.
to cope with changes over time. So I think Celeb's done a great service in talking about that. His concept of the black swan talking about this is really about nonlinear processes and chaotic processes can generate variations in systems which far exceed what we call the standard deviation. So economists, we discovered probability in the 19, well, going back to the 1500s, but formalized a lot in the 1900s, and we got the idea of the normal distribution. And the normal distribution is what happens when you have a evolutionary process that doesn't interact with other evolutionary processes. So, like my height, for example, doesn't affect your height. Okay, so when you look at the height of people, you get a standard deviation. There'd be an average height, and then 68% of people are within one standard deviation, and 95% within two, and so on and so forth. You get to five standard deviations, you can rule it out. Anything more than five standard deviations just so vanishingly rare you can treat it as impossible. But
Right.
in a chaotic system or a complex system, because one thing interacts with something else, then a change here, a small change in one point, can cause a cascade of events causing a large change somewhere else. And you can get changes which are 20 and 30 and 40 standard deviations. So when you look at earthquakes, for example, because the movement of one part of the crust of the planet affects the rest of the crust of the planet, then a small movement somewhere can cascade as a whole lot of other movements, and you get this huge 20 and 30 standard deviation movement, which you'll never see if you think in normal distribution terms. Now, seismologists are aware of that. That's huge. The data just tells them that earthquakes are distributed what they call a power law, and that will give you potentially infinite variance. You can't actually work out a standard deviation to begin with, but if you do nonetheless apply the stats, then you find that rather than getting a normal distribution of earthquakes, you get what's called a power law distribution. And the number of earthquakes of an extremely small scale, huge number of those, the earthquakes of a large scale, tiny number of those. And if you have a log of if you take the number of earthquakes on the horizontal axis and the power of those earthquakes on the vertical axis, and you have a logarithmic scale, so you have one earthquake, 10 earthquakes, 100 earthquakes, where you normally have one, two, and three, and the same for the magnitude, you get a straight line. That's called a power
Right.
law. Now, what Taleb is doing is bringing awareness of that across to the finance sector. So that's quite extremely worthwhile. But it then means people can say, oh, the global financial crisis is the black swan. It was a random event caused by a power interaction which we don't necessarily understand. Nobody could have seen it coming. Bullshit. Okay, not saying Taleb's wrong there. I'm saying the neoclassicals who've twisted his thought to say, oh, it's a black swan, we couldn't have seen it coming. No, you idiots, you're not looking at the level of credit.
Right.
Okay, so you look at the level of credit, you can see the causal process, and that's why I saw the crisis coming. Rubini did, Baker did, and a handful of other economists, and quite a few people who were smart enough not to listen to economists saw it coming as well. Okay, but economics was again put blindfolds over their eyes and thought anything more than a three standard deviation movement is impossible, so don't need to worry about a stock market crash. Now, to give
Right.
an idea of the scale of the stock market crash, the crash that occurred in 2000 and then in 2007 was something like 15 or 20 standard deviations compared to the average change. And people say, oh, that can't happen. Well, it did. And that's because the economy is a complex system, not a linear one.
Right. So, talking about financial crisis, I'm from India, and a, a large percentage of the audience is probably from there too. So, do you have any, is there any possibility? I mean, are you aware of any possibilities of financial crisis happening over here? And do you have any takes on our economy over here?
Oh, I don't know the Indian data. So
Okay. Okay.
I'm only a single human being. I can't cover
Right.
every country on the
Right.
planet.
Right. Right. No, I just want to know if you
Yeah,
had.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, but in general, I think because we had a financial crisis in 2007, of course, that mainly affected Western economies. Although I don't know about India in that situation. The Asian financial crisis is in 1997, for example. And you look at the Western financial crisis, the global financial crisis, as it was called, that left a residue of private debt that's so high that and like what happened, the same thing happened in the Great Depression, but the level of debt fell by two-thirds. So you had a peak debt level of about 150% of GDP in the Great Depression. By the time the Great Depression and World War II were over, the level was 50% of GDP. and therefore you could have an increase in credit without making the debt unpayable. It reached 170% in America in 2007, and then it fell. Now, the fall, rather than going from 170% to say 60%, which would have been a similar reduction in private debt to what happened in the Great Depression, we've gone from 170% to 150%. And part of it, again, the reason we haven't reduced the debt level so much is neoclassical economists think increasing debt's a really good idea. You know, they were saying they want to get banks back to lending money again. They didn't realize that banks lending too much money is what caused the crisis in the first place. So the result is, rather than a two-thirds reduction in the level of private debt, we've only had about a one-sixth reduction in the level of private debt. And that means that there's still too much of a drag on the economy from debt service costs. And people are also unwilling to borrow too much money because they're afraid they might not be able to repay it. So you
Right.
don't get the same boom and bust that occurred back in 2007. So I don't expect a financial crisis in the West. Now, India could be in a different situation there because, the Russian financial crisis and the Asian financial crisis both preceded the global financial crisis. Maybe India's got one in train. I'd be looking at the level of private debt, and I'd be looking at this rate of change.
Right.
And then you
So,
could diagnose. Yeah.
right. So, as citizens of a country, how do we analyze the strength of the economy? Is GDP a good measure, or what do you think we should be looking at?
Well, you have to look at the distribution of income as well as the level. And that's a large part of why countries like India are stuffed up, because you've got an extremely unequal distribution of income and power. Uh, and you don't generate the mass market you could have if you didn't have that huge inequality. So a
Hmm.
large part of the reason why China has outdone India is that China addressed the inequality in the revolutionary period by basically eliminating all the landlords. Okay? You've still got a huge landlord class. You've still got the inequality that comes out of that. You therefore can't get the mass market demand that ultimately China was able to create by getting rid of the inequality. And a huge part of the Chinese system is on avoiding a large growth in inequality. So they're happy to have billionaires evolve, but they've also thrown some billionaires in jail for what they see as bad behavior. And like Z just came out recently and said, if you want to make money, don't become a bureaucrat. Okay, if you want to be a bureaucrat, you want to do public service, make that your focus, not making money. And if you use your position to enrich yourself, we'll kill you. Okay, because they really do have, there are executions in China still. So that means that people's sort of rapacious behavior you see out of the American financial system, people are wary about doing that in China for very good reasons. And therefore you don't get the level of corruption and you don't get to the same level of inequality, and you get more of a mass market out of the whole system. And the
Right.
Chinese are also, they want to build the industrial and capability of the country. So they're building infrastructure all the time, which the West ignores. So John Kenneth Galbraith, another great non-orthodox economist, once said that America is characterized by what he called private affluence and public squalor. And so that's why America is such a miserable place for the poor, because they live in the squalor, while the rich live in the affluence, and they're like two different planets. China's very careful not to let that happen. So they want public affluence. And what you get in their public spaces is that sense of public affluence. And then that actually means people are more willing to innovate. And so I think that's the main lesson, that if India wants to learn from China, what it's got to learn to some extent is to not necessarily eliminate, but drastically reduce the inequality that characterizes Indian society.
Right. So, talking about inequality, is it a feature or a bug of capitalism? Because we could argue that if there is no inequality, there probably is no motivation for people to create.
Yeah,
I don't know.
it's a bug and a feature. You're quite right. It's got both characteristics. You want you want the potential for gain to mean people are going to be entrepreneurs and try to innovate something. So that's why I'm doing that myself with my Revel software. I want to use Revel to attack what's called the business intelligence market, because as well as having the mathematical modeling capability I've shown, it's also got a way of analyzing data using a tool we call a Ravel. And the Ravel is a graphical way of handling multidimensional data. So one of the great hassles of spreadsheets is they're just two-dimensional. Ravel is multiple dimensional. Data is multidimensional. We've got a better framework for handling complex data than Excel has. And then
Hmm.
Excel uses pivot tables and they're really cumbersome and people can't learn them. We've got an easier one. So I've made that innovation and I hope to sell it for a fortune and finance what I'm doing in economics that way. And that evolutionary, that behavior of producing it only, well, I wouldn't have put the effort into producing it unless I thought that effort could make a return for me. So I
Right.
understand the need for inequality to that extent. But then what you get is lock-in. So if you have a particular technology that makes you dominant in a society, then if that gives you a position of power against new people coming up as well, you can use that power to block potential people to do what you've done. And therefore, that's where it becomes a bug. So you need to find that balance between enabling the capacity for entrepreneurs, people with great ideas, to come up with great products that improve life for everybody and make a profit for themselves. You've got to balance that against getting what my great friend Yanis Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism, where you get a body like Apple, for example, where people distribute applications through Apple's shop, and then Apple insists on a 30% share of all revenue. And that's what they're doing at the moment. You think, you're screwing me. You didn't produce, Apple didn't produce my innovation, I did. And I've got to pay 30% to Apple just to get people to buy my innovation. Basically, pardon the French, but fuck you.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm.
now that's the when it becomes a bug. So you need regulation, intelligent regulation to prevent that sort of thing happening. And you need also to say sometimes some products start in the private sector and then become something which should be public. So, for example, social media. I mean, if you get social medias or media itself dominated by billionaire interests, they're likely to twist the news as they have done and distort what we learn. So there are some services where you want public control to prevent private empires being formed and preventing development over time. We haven't done a very good job on that front.
Right. 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 So, okay, but moving on to one of the most misunderstood or complicated topics, in my opinion, is probably inflation. Do you have anything to say about inflation? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it necessary? And in the current
Yeah,
day and age, it's pretty high.
yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of factors about capitalism which make it a complicated system. So inflation, the neoclassical vision of what causes inflation is too much money. Yeah. Too much money chasing too few goods. That's this cliche people would have heard all the time. That implies that money is a control. Okay? If you don't have the money, you can't put the prices up. It tends to be the other way around because if the monetary system doesn't expand, then that is a constraint upon what prices can be set. But the money system is accommodative, it does expand. So, for example, if you have a credit card, you can create money. Let's say you've got a credit card and you've got zero balance and you've got 100,000 rupiah as your ceiling. Well, you can go to a shop and buy something for 100,000 rupiah and you literally create 100,000 rupiah of money by doing that. So if you then, like if you might, let's say you want, I don't know what this works out in terms of rupiah. I don't know the exchange rate, but let's say you want to buy something which is 75,000 rupiah, and and they put the price up to 85,000. Oh shit, I still want it, so I'll put the price, I'll buy it with a credit card. So the money system accommodates the increase in prices. And we take a look at back when the inflation began in the West in earnest, it was in the 1970s. And at that time you had for 30 years, the oil companies, they were called the Seven Sisters, the seven major oil companies, all Western, obviously, they would just continue paying the Arabs $2.50 a barrel. And they did it for something like 30 years. That's the price we
Wow.
paid for a barrel of oil. In the 1970s, after the Yom Kippur War, when the Israelis defeated the Arab armies in 6 days, the Arab response, they'd formed the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries at that stage. They said, right, we're going to boycott any country that helped Israel. Of course, that included America. So the oil price in America, and America's an oil producer itself, but the oil price went from $2.50 a barrel to 10. And now what that meant was the money supply increased because all these companies had lines of credit, which are like the bank and MasterCards we have these days, lines of credit, meaning they had the right to increase their debt to a group of banks by pre-negotiated contracts. So when the oil price rose by a factor of four, they simply paid it, and that created money. So rather than increasing money causing change in prices, it's the other way around. A change in prices causes a change in the money supply. Now, you can get periods where the rate of growth of the money supply is so great that increases the capacity of workers' demand wage rises and firms to increase the markup they put on the cost of production. So there are periods where the feedback can go in the opposite direction. But fundamentally, the direction of causation is price changes cause changes in the money supply. Okay?
Right.
So, so that's one part. Another part is that people have this automatic attitude that money, I've got money, I don't want inflation, it's going to reduce its value. Now, you've got a car, you don't want it to depreciate. Can you stop it depreciating? Okay.
No.
Physical things depreciate. Okay, so the fact that money doesn't depreciate is actually a quirk. It's not a feature of money, and this leads to people believing money should maintain a constant value, and they complain about it declining in value because of inflation. But everything else you've got is going to degrade.
But there are
That
many physical things that do not depreciate, though,
no,
right?
there's none.
What about
There's
land and gold, real estate and gold, which do
Well,
appreciate?
land degrades, houses degrade unless you maintain them. Okay, gold doesn't change. Gold is an element. Okay, you
But
need
in,
to
in,
create.
in perceived value, it might increase.
That's a different story. I'm
That's
talking
a
about the
different.
physical capability.
Okay, okay.
The chair you're sitting on is going to be a waste at some stage. Somebody's going to throw the chair you're sitting on into a garbage bin at some stage. Okay,
Hmm.
everything physical depreciates. This is the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, everything is subject to entropy. Now, there's a great physicist, or a chemist rather, uh, Fred Soddy, who argued back in the 1920s that money should also depreciate. Now, when you think about it, if money doesn't depreciate, what are you going to do? You're going to hang on to it. If money's increasing in value, you're not going to spend it. Okay? So there are people talk about three functions for money. They talk about it being a means of a unit of account. Okay, that's always going to be true. A measure of value, always going to be true, and a means of exchange, a measure of
Store of
account,
value.
and a store of value. Yeah. Now, if you focus on the store of value side of things, then if something's increasing in value, why spend it? Okay. So if you focus upon the store of value side of money, you're going to spend money less rapidly. So if you have a monetary unit which is appreciating rather than depreciating, so you have deflation rather than inflation, that means you're less likely to spend, which means there's less commerce. So you're defeating the purpose of money, to want it
Right,
to maintain its value or increase in value. So in fact, if you have a depreciating currency, you're more likely to spend. So if you want the monetary system to enable a level of transactions, you actually want it to depreciate. And this is a proposal put forward by an Argentinian businessman called Silvio Gesell. And this was actually used by a local council in Austria in World War II, when the Great Depression, when the unemployment rate was 25%. The mayor of that town called, what's it called, Wargle, the mayor of that town was a fan of Gazelle's ideas. The money system had collapsed, the money supply had plunged. So he thought, I'll create my local money and let people use this local script to pay council rates, but they can also use it for trade with each other. And if you hang on to it, you've got to put a stamp on it each week, and the stamp depreciates its value. You can only avoid doing that if you use it to buy something for somebody else. Well, that worked so well that Wargle went from 25% unemployment to zero very rapidly. Did a whole lot of public works to build bridges over the river. It improves facilities. Town boomed until the central bank came and said, you can't create money, that's our job. And they shut it down. Wargle went back to 25% unemployment, and shortly after that, they voted for Hitler. So money that depreciates actually might be a more effective means of enabling commerce. Then at the same time, you don't want to have such a level of commerce that you destroy the biosphere. So money, by getting rewarded for producing goods and services, you're not being penalized for producing waste, which is inevitable if you're going to produce goods and services. So there's all sorts of complexities in how you work out what the value of money should be and what money itself should be. Money should be, in some way, should reflect the damage we do in producing output as well as the monetary revenue we make from selling refined goods, because when you sell the iron ore, you dump the slag. Okay? So it's not by any means a straightforward issue, but in terms of a functioning monetary system, you'd actually want money to depreciate like everything else does. So trying to avoid inflation is a bad thing, but a small amount of inflation is bearable because that partially accommodates, a high level of economic activity. When you get hyperinflation, then you get breakdown. But if you take a look at the data, there's only been about 5 instances of hyperinflation in economic history, never in one of the major economies. And it's always been after something which massively damages physical facilities, and then the government prints money to try to paper over the physical damage, can't do it, so the paper becomes a runaway train. And that's what we saw in Zimbabwe and Weimar Republic Germany, long before Hitler came to power, 10 years before Hitler, um, and that sort of stuff. That's hyperinflation. So you want to avoid that, but a moderate level of inflation actually does that effective depreciation of money, which encourages a level of commerce. So you can find the velocity of circulation of money is partially inversely related to the rate of inflation. And a small rate of inflation actually encourages a high rate of turnover of money, which gives you more economic activity.
Right, right, right. That makes sense. All right, Mr.
I'm getting
Professors.
close to when I should think of moving on to something else, by the way. So,
Yes, yes.
yeah.
So, there are a lot of students studying economics nowadays, and a
Mm.
lot of students do, and you've achieved a lot of success in academia and more. So, what are some pieces of advice you would give to students in aspiring economists?
Don't study economics, okay? Because economics at the university is dominated by neoclassicals, and you're going to get a distorted picture of how the economy operates. You're better off learning it yourself. So that's why I'm teaching my courses online. I have an online course which is advertised through a website called stevekeen.com. Uh, and it's private and commercial, okay? But I teach what I know is right in that course. If you go to a university, you're going to get all this neoclassical nonsense, unless you find somebody like me as a heretic who teaches non-orthodox approaches. So be very careful who you do an economics degree with. I think a better thing to learn is what economists have resisted: system dynamics, and that's what my Ravel software is based upon. They've resisted it because that eliminates equilibrium, which has become an obsession for neoclassical economists. So what I prefer people to do is to study system dynamics and then apply that to economics. Jump over the fact that academic economic departments are dominated by neoclassical economists. So I'm not saying don't study at university. I'm saying just study a bit of economics, enough to get a degree in the subject if you want to work as one, but learn system dynamics. Learn what engineers learn as mathematics, and learn complex systems, learn a bit of biology, and that way you can become somebody who'll be useful as an economist rather than somebody who's dangerous.
Moving on from people who want to study economics, what about young people who are part of this financial landscape in this capitalistic world? What advice do you have for them to
Well,
navigate this complex system?
learn non-orthodox economics. That's why, but there's books I haven't written enough books on the topic, but one of my books is called The New Economics, a Manifesto, and that gives you an alternative way to think about the economy. I just know that the mainstream thought way of thinking should have failed 100 years ago. The mainstream neoclassical theory, starting from its precepts, led to a number of logical and empirical contradictions, which started to accumulate in the 1920s and 1930s. So, if economics was genuinely a science, in the next 10 or 20 years after that, it would have undergone a revolution and the neoclassical school would have disappeared. Instead, because it's got this ideological side to it, you had these schisms, and people preserve it because they like the ideological conclusions without even being aware that's what they're doing. The whole way of thinking is caught up in thinking in terms of equilibrium and supply and demand. But it's not a science. It's failed at the university level. So study non-orthodox economists, read what learn what complex systems analysis does and how engineers model systems, and apply that to the economy. That's a better thing for you to do than study neoclassical economics.
No, I was talking about people who are navigating this world, this financial,
Uh,
not apart
yeah.
from people who are studying economics.
Yeah, well, it's it's a complex world. So I mean, I certainly don't trust mainstream economists. That's number one. Okay. Um, it's there's not very much you can do because you're a tiny element in a large system, and to be able to survive while a large system is doing the wrong thing is not straightforward. So I'd be when you look at the economics the approach that I take to it, based on empirical data, logical constructs, first principles thinking, it leads you to realizing you need a government sector to take care of the long-term infrastructure and structure of the economy that the private sector won't do because it can't make a profit in time that justifies those investments. You need the private sector as well for the things which involve innovation that a public sector is not going to do as well. So you need a balance between the two, a yin and a yang. Think about the economy that way. Learn like Confucian and the Taoist religion in that sense, the idea of balance, yin and yang. Learn that and apply that to economics. For God's sake, don't fall for the trap of thinking like a Westerner.
All right, all right. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add, Professor,
No, I
before?
think that does me. It's a pretty long discussion, a couple of hours.
Yes,
So
yes,
probably
yes.
have a bit of editing